Good evening and welcome to the Bishkek Express podcast, a podcast where in each episode we discuss hot topics in Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia, and beyond. I'm your host, Austin Reach. This evening, we have the pleasure to host Dr. Sean Guillory. Dr. Guillory is a digital scholarship curator in the Russian and East European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh and the host of the Eurasian podcast. Additionally, our guest is highly accomplished in the domains of audio narrative production, documentary crafting, and the art of storytelling. With over a decade of experience, Dr. Guillory is a seasoned researcher specializing in the nuanced dynamics of Russian politics, economics, society, and culture. He's also written for Jacobin, the Moscow Times, Kyiv Post, and more. I also just want to say, you're one of the OGs of the East European, post-Soviet, Russian podcast realm. So thank you for that. This evening's podcast unveils the obscured history of Lovett Fort-Whiteman, a man who was the first and only of many things. The first African-American to enroll in a communist international training school in the Soviet Union, the first national organizer of the American Negro Labor Congress, and his death stands as the sole documented African-American fatality of Joseph Stalin's Great Purge. Of note, Dr. Guillory is also working on an audio documentary about this man's life. Sean, добро пожаловать.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I don't know where you got that very elaborate and flattering bio, but thank you for
Yes,
that.
Absolutely. I'm a creeper on LinkedIn, and I saw you shudder a minute whenever I was reading off the journals or the newspapers you've written for. Was there a mistake in there?
I don't think I've ever written anything for the Kyiv Post.
Interesting.
Unless they republish something, but I don't know. You never know with the internet, right?
I think that must have been the case because whenever I did a Google search, Kyiv Post had you listed and they had a little bio beneath something.
Oh, go figure.
Well, just more credibility there.
I guess so.
So before we begin, let's talk about you a little bit. I've been listening to your podcast since I was 21 years old. Now I'm 26, so I remember being in Warsaw, Poland, walking home from the gym, listening to you talk about Tajik remittances, or whenever I was chopping wood in my hometown, I remember listening to a podcast about Kazakh nomads. So I've been around since it was the SRB podcast, so I can't believe I have you on the show today. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, if you don't mind, can you walk us through your academic and professional journey and how it's gotten you to where you are now?
Sure. And excuse me if I cough. I'm getting over the last stages of a cold. So essentially, the short version is this. I did my PhD at UCLA in history. It's modern European history, but I emphasized in Russia. That's the official designation. And I studied under the scholar Arch Getty, who, those of you who have ever read a book on Stalinist terror, you've probably heard his name or actually read him at some point. He's one of the biggest scholars of the terror. And I finished in 2009 and bumped around a little bit, went to Russia for about 9 months and then had a visiting position in Illinois. And then I got a 3-year postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh, and I did that. And I, like a lot of people, I did not win the lottery and get a tenure track academic job, which at the time was incredibly psychologically damaging. You know, it's kind of like, okay, what am I going to do when I grow up now? Like, what do I do? And I'd started this, I'd been blogging about Russia since 2005. And I've always had an interest in audio, and I did a stint at Marshall Poe's New Books in Eurasian Studies. And I've done some audio work in the past when I lived in Los Angeles. So I figured, why don't I start my own podcast since I've done it, and I enjoy the medium. And I somehow convinced the University of Pittsburgh's Russian East European Eurasian Studies Center to hire me, or maybe somebody else convinced them. I don't know, but. Nowadays, I mostly do narrative. Well, besides the Eurasian Not podcast, I do narrative audio. I do documentaries, and I've done one documentary called Teddy Goes to USSR. And as you mentioned, I'm working on another one on Lovett Fort-Whiteman, tentatively titled The Reddest of the Blacks.
Indeed. That'll be the focal point of today's podcast. And with Teddy Goes to the USSR, it's a 6-part series, correct?
Yes.
And what's the origins of Teddy Goes to the USSR?
That's actually a really interesting story because I got an email I think it was in October 2019, a few months before the pandemic, from a Ukrainian researcher and journalist named Edward Andrushenko, who's since published a really great book called KGB. He runs a Telegram channel called KGB Files, and he published a book on KGB documents in Ukrainian. Anyway, so he said, "Hey, I found this KGB report about this American guy named Teddy Rowe. Maybe." Maybe he's still alive. Maybe I can do an article about him. Sean, you can do some audio podcast about him, whatever. So, of course, the first thing I did is I went to Google and searched, and I found, a couple of Teddy Rowes. But, through kind of checking and putting it against other evidence, I found him. And I sent him an email and I said, "Hey, this is who I am. This Ukrainian guy sent me this KGB report about you. Are you the Teddy Rowe that's in this report?" And it happened to be him. Teddy went to the Soviet Union in 1968 for 3 months, which is pretty unusual. Most tourists went for, your average week to 10 days. And he went to every single Soviet republic, which is even more unusual. Through the Caucasus, through Central Asia, on this Trans-Siberian Railroad, Ukraine, every republic. And he told me he had a 400-page diary of his travels and about, a couple hundred photographs. So I booked a flight he lives in Billings, Montana. And I should also say about Teddy is his career was working in the United States Congress as an aide for Mike Mansfield, who is one of the giants of the Democratic Party and one of the few senators against the Vietnam War by the late 1960s. And I assumed that because Teddy was connected to the American government in some way, shape, or form, this is why the Soviets literally broke into his hotel room and took photos of his diary and, the whole thing that we've heard. They probably thought that they could learn something about the American government, or who knows. Anyways, I went to Billings, Montana and interviewed Teddy for a couple of days and came back and interviewed some historians to give some context to his travels and created a 6-part documentary.
There is so much depth to this. That is incredible. I mean,
yeah,
I thought it was just this cheeky coy, Teddy goes to the USSR, but man, that context is insane.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah. It was a great find, and it was a fun project, but it was a very difficult project because I had never done narrative audio before, so I was kind of learning as I go along, and I have to say I'm still learning as I go along.
Mm. Wow. And had he had a long-born interest in Eurasia, or what was the reason for Russia? 3 months?
Yeah, he had taken some classes in college, and mind you, this is in the 1950s that he's doing this. He actually went to the way he got to the Soviet Union is he got a grant from the Political Science Association, and he'd gone to South America before, so it was part of a 2-part trip, one to South America and one to the Soviet Union. And until this day, he has a really deep interest in South America and Russia. So he had taken Russian and all of these things. So he was kind of familiar, or at least interested when he went.
Incredible. And to visit every republic, I mean, he must have had a pretty vast understanding of non-European Russia in that case, I'm assuming.
No, I don't think his knowledge of Soviet history and Russian society and Soviet society it's akin to, I'm saying before his experience being in country, his knowledge and familiarity was akin to any interested reader, right? He didn't have I don't think he had any special knowledge about, non-Russian minorities or Central Asia or anything like that. I think he created an itinerary for himself where he wanted to travel around and see the different parts of Soviet society, which, he successfully did.
I'm still flabbergasted. That's essentially like his own version of Eastern approaches that he made himself. Incredible.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting. It was interesting to hear him talk about this, and this is in the documentary, and the documentary is really about this, and that is about an American guy who, like many Americans then and now, have all sorts of assumptions about Soviet life. and then goes to the Soviet Union and experiences, everyday life, talks to people. He's even invited a couple of times to people's homes. He's also monitored by the KGB, et cetera, et cetera. And how the challenge is, how do we weigh our assumptions against our experience? Does our experience change the way we understand that place, or does it confirm a lot of the stuff we already assumed? And I think for Teddy, it's kind of a yes and no. There was lots of, and you can see this in the documentary, there's lots of contradictions in his own story. And I'll just give you one example. He talked a lot about how, they hid everything from me. They tried to control where I went. I had these like guides who would give me your standard tourist story about the greatness of the Soviet Union, blah, 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 blah. And then I asked him at some point, I'm like, okay, so Teddy, how much time did you spend just kind of walking around by yourself? And he said, oh, that was probably 90% of the time. And he's like, these official meetings with people, I maybe can count on one hand. And I'm like, but so Teddy, if they're trying to hide everything from you, why are you able to walk around all the time? So you get kind of that, right? So, it's that whole kind of thing about, America and America's understanding of the outside world and the Soviet Union in particular.
It's just a trinket of that timestamp, like Cold War. It's incredible. I'll have to revisit Teddy Goes to the USSR. Backing up a little bit about you went to Russia for 9 months. Where did you go? What were you doing?
So I've been to Russia several times, but my two longest stays, my first one was for 10 months in 2005, and then back in 2009 for another 9 months. And that was actually with my wife, who was a Russian historian as well. No longer, but she got a Fulbright, and we went there as part of her dissertation research.
Amazing. And what region, what city?
Oh, Moscow, a little bit of St. Petersburg, but mostly in Moscow. When I did my research in 2005, I spent 3 months in Ryazan, which is, part of the Moscow orbit, but that's pretty much it.
Very well. And going with the genesis of this interest, what sparked your interest in Russia, Soviet Union, Eurasia?
I think, probably like a lot of Americans, growing up in the 1980s, it was one of those, evil empire, these people who were going to destroy us, right? Having the whole, nightmares as a kid with nuclear war, all of the Cold War movies, really in the early 80s, really creating this atmosphere of like, oh my God, this country wants to annihilate us. It's us or them. But, with that, there is always a feeling of like, okay, so who are these people? I think like a lot of people, I was drawn into the exoticism of that place. Another thing, and then I started taking a couple of classes, and another inspiration, of course, was politics, being attracted and involved in left-wing politics, wanting to understand, okay, so what was a communist society like? Those were my entries, and my interests have changed and evolved over the years. My dissertation, for example, was on the Young Communist League in the 1920s, and really focusing on the question of, for an organization that grows rapidly in the 1920s to 2 million members by 1928, what does it mean to be a young communist? And how did they form that identity, as members throughout that decade? And that I should say that dissertation came out of my own life experience, being involved in like punk rock and alternative movements, and seeing this dynamic of internal regulation and control over the meaning of, say, something like what is punk. And I saw a lot of the Komsomol had a lot of similarities in terms of trying to regulate behavior, trying to regulate dress, in terms of defining what a young communist is supposed to be like.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to me like the 1920s and 1930s were like a golden era of interest for you. Is that so?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, that was my focus. Mm-hmm.
Great. And returning to the podcast, I've been listening since 2018, but how old is the Eurasian Knot and your impetus for starting the Eurasian Knot? I've read a little bit about it, and an article that was somewhat of an interview, but could you please walk us through that?
You mean in terms of changing the name or the origin of it?
The origin of SRB to yes.
So yeah, I started the SRB podcast in February 2015. And like a lot of these types of projects, you do a couple of episodes and then you disappear. So I disappeared for like 6 months. I didn't do any episodes, and then I revived it, and it's been going pretty steadily since, outside of a couple of breaks and things like this. And then and it did very well. It does very well for it being a niche kind of topic, right? I know I'm never going to make big money off of this, nor do I seek to. And really the mission of the show is, as somebody who has been through graduate school, worked in academia, I have lots of friends and colleagues who are involved in scholarship, journalists, et cetera, like a lot of people professionally connected to that place. And the idea is to take that knowledge, which for people, regular people, don't have access to. They don't have access to academic journals. They don't have access to academic books. A lot of the time, they're prohibitively expensive. And frankly, a lot of them just aren't that interesting to read as a reading. So the idea is to, do an interview with somebody about the type of work they do. Because even myself, I might not read a book. Say, NPR has an interview with an author. I may not read the book, but I'll listen to a 45-minute interview about it, right? So the idea is to try to translate that scholarship to a more accessible means for people to access it, to add some kind of small contribution to popularizing the expert work done by many.
And I think you've done just that. I mean, it was so satisfying to find that outlet for this great interest as someone who is unhealthily obsessed with this area of the world. And it was yours, and also the Caucasus Talk podcast. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but it's mostly about the North Caucasus region of Russia. But yeah, those two were, that was my sustenance for a very long time, with just like how to have this outlet for my interest. But amazing. And I regret to inform you that as a very poor university student, I'm not on your distinguished table of ranks. But I would like to give you my opinion on my favorite episodes that I've listened to on the podcast. And in no particular order, I really enjoy Eurasianet on Eurasia, Mixed Marriages in the USSR, and Stories Along the Trans-Siberian. Do you think I have pretty good taste?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I remember doing, a lot of times I don't remember doing interviews that I've done, just because I've done so many of them and they go one ear and out the other. But I do distinctly remember the one with Josh Kucera and Peter Leonard. I think Leonard is his last name, because they happened to be in Pittsburgh. And I so rarely do, in face-to-face interviews, that when I do them, pull somebody into the studio on campus, it's really satisfying because I feel like it's a better conversation than doing all of these interviews remotely. Though, people should know that about 99% of the podcasts you listen to out there, the interviews are done remotely.
Yes, I've noticed. As of Eurasian Not recent events, it seems like you guys have been on a theology kick lately. Like 5 of the 6 last episodes since I think August have been to do with faith, religion, theology. So what explains that?
Well, there are 2 more. The one I released right before getting on with you is about shamanism and indigeneity. And the series, and there's one more coming out next week on Islam and on Crimea and Crimean Tatars. So the religion series was as part of my job at the University of Pittsburgh is I have to put on every semester I have to put on a speaker series. And what I've been doing for the last several years, I think I've done maybe 9 or 10 of these series, I can't remember. Instead of having someone come and give a paper, which is very hit or miss, I do live interviews with them. And at first, the first couple of ones that I did, they were on campus, in person, invite somebody out and record the interview and then put it up as a podcast. And then when the pandemic hit, I started to do them online only. And I've continued to do them online just because it's more cost effective, right? I can do a larger series for a lot less money if doing it remotely. And so the series I did in the spring semester, this last spring semester, was on religion in socialist and post-socialist societies. This topic came about because an anthropologist named Zuzanna Bogomil, who's in Poland at the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnology at the Polish Academy of Sciences, she approached me and asked me if I'd be interested in doing a series based on some project that she's working on. So we worked together. It was a really great experience because it connected me with topics and issues and people that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And I have to say, like, it was quite a treat for me because I learned so much. I know very little about religion, and particularly in places like China or in Crimea or, these types of things. Or Catholicism in Poland. So that's the origin of that series. And it's about to wrap up, which I'm also looking forward to do some other things.
Okay. I love it. I love it. So do you have a new perspective on theology, you think?
Well, I have thought for a long time, my younger years, it's like, the usual, like, religion, blah, 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 blah. I don't want anything to do with it. It's all crap. But of course, as you get older, you start to take on different perspectives. And what's interesting for me is the role of faith, religious practice, and identity in societies. And one can say whatever they want about the existence of God and religion like this. You cannot ignore the fact that religion plays a very big role in the world, and in some places more and more. So it allowed me, and granted, that's a very banal statement in many ways, but at least for me, it gave me an appreciation for understanding how religion persists, how it changes, how it defines identities, and how it involves itself in politics. And really, I think the one thing that I walked away with was the idea how religion allows someone to ground themselves in a time that we're experiencing now, which everything seems to be shifting under our feet. And religion seems to provide that something to hold on to for tradition, for identity, etc.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And I think I'm getting closer and closer to finding my exact niche in Russian Eurasian studies. I'm in love with Central Asia and historically Turkic empires in those lands. But the more I explore, the more salient religion and theology is. And I think it's super, super interesting. So I'm very excited for the Tatar and Islam episode. That'll be amazing.
Yes, definitely.
So aside from theology, I think it's very apparent through the titles and the content of the Eurasian Knot that African and African American studies have been very important and interesting in your field of study. Since 2019, there's been 9 episodes that I counted related to Africa or African American topics. I can't remember which podcast, and forgive me if I've totally misremembered, but I think if you had not gone down a path of Russian Eurasian studies, you could have seen yourself looking at African American studies. Is that true?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I actually, many times, especially nowadays, I kick myself that I didn't do African American history, which was the other thing I was interested in. But of course, when you go into graduate school, it's so hard to, balance one's kind of pet interests with one's main interests. But I have been fortunate enough to return to it and learn a lot. But yeah, that is a good read on your part in the sense that if I wasn't doing Russia, and let me tell you, since the beginning of the Ukraine war, I'd rather do anything else except for Russia. And so focusing on African Americans and this part of history, African American relationships with radicalism, communism, and the Soviet Union has allowed me to maintain a connection to, Soviet history on the one hand, and also satisfy myself with exploring, Black history in America.
Indeed. And with these interests, you like Russian, Eurasia, African American studies, you've allowed them to kind of cross-pollinate in the podcast with African students in the USSR, Black radicalism in the Soviet Union. So would it be fair to say there really is a convergence between these areas of study for you personally?
Oh, for sure. For sure. And I think, and it's also, though some more and more people are now finally writing about it, it's a wide open, in many respects, wide open field of scholarship, exploring. I mean, I know a couple of people, graduate students, who are writing and researching now about the Black experience in Eurasia, and what does Blackness mean in this more international context? What is racism? What does race mean in these international contexts? Because in one of the things I've learned over the years is that from an American perspective, Americans, because race is so saturating, right? We can't exist outside of the bubble, outside of the matrix of race in America. It has historically saturated our experience. And as a result, a lot of times we think that race, the meaning of race and the practice of racism and the ideology of race and racism is universal. But, when you look around the world in different contexts, they have their own. Race is not the same in Brazil, for example, than it is in America. And then the question comes, well, what about a place like, the former Soviet Union or the former Russian Empire, where there was an existence of a concept of race, but it didn't have the defining power that we find in, say, the United States for sure, or the Caribbean, or Central and South America, or Canada for that matter. So I think it allows, for me personally, it allows a reflection on my own assumptions and understandings of race and racism in history and in the present, by looking at a different context where other terms and other concepts were more dominant and looking at otherness.
Mm-hmm. I think that's also another really good podcast, is something to do. I'm going to butcher the name, but Ideologies of Race in the Soviet Union. Amazing episode. So before we talk about the story of the man of the hour, Lovett Fort-Whiteman, let's talk about the audio documentary you're making about him. So upon researching, I noticed you already have a podcast episode that aired in 2019, as well as a brief YouTube documentary coming out that same year about Lovett Fort-Whiteman. So what are your plans for the upcoming audio documentary?
So that short documentary, I had taken essentially a weekend filmmaking workshop, and I had just started researching him at the time, and I decided to make a short documentary about him, and elements, certain facts of that piece will certainly be in the larger project. That will be I have planned 6 episodes. I certainly will talk about why he was arrested and my understanding about why he's arrested, which differs from, I think, a lot of people who've written about him. And really exploring, the intricacies as best I can, as the sources allow, for his life, his upbringing, his family, and others around him in his journey from, growing up in Dallas, Texas, to ending up in Colima in Magadan and dying. So the plan of the documentary is really to flesh out his story and try to understand. I think one is to rehabilitate his memory, because he was forgotten until 1990, when a journalist named Alan Kolosin found his NKVD file in Kazakhstan. And as I'm doing research, there's a lot to uncover about his life. And another thing that's really important to me is not to make the story of his life a tragedy, which is, the go-to, right? He was arrested. He was sent to a forced labor camp. He died. Like you opened, he was a victim of Stalin's terror. That is all true. But I think to reduce his life to that is a disservice to the experiences he had. So I really want to show, looking at a person like him, how for Black Americans like him, how travel, migration, international connections opened up a world that, in an understanding of themselves, in an anti-colonial struggle, in a global anti-racist struggle, and how that shaped his worldview and others like him.
I must say, I love that angle of not misconstruing him through victimhood, but I think rehabilitation is a very good way to describe that story. And as a disclaimer, I've only done some cursory research about him, but it does seem like there are some significant gaps in this man's story. So within the Eurasian knot, there's already an episode about him. There's other episodes about Black engagement with Soviet communism. And you and your guests have mentioned the likes of Claude McKay, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Langston Hughes. And I'm curious why Lovett Fort-Whiteman sticks out among the other prominent African-American intellectuals. I mean, I know he's got an amazing story, but it seems like there is some, not overlap, but they do have some similar circumstances with traveling, meeting people, taking the world by storm, and just the notoriety.
Yeah. And they all knew each other. Like Fort-Whiteman, wrote letters to W.B. Du Bois. When Langston Hughes came to the Soviet Union to make this film Black and White, Fort-Whiteman was a consultant on this project. They were in the same social political circles, him and Claude McKay, for example. And I lost my train of thought in the question. What were you asking again?
What makes him stand out among the other intellectuals? Yes.
Yes. I mean, obviously, what makes him stand out first and foremost is the fact that he, was arrested in the Soviet Union, and he's one of, not a lot of Americans were swept up in the terror. We have only estimates, maybe a couple of hundred, maybe 1,000. But it's nothing like the Poles or the Germans or any other foreign nationals who were in the borders of the Soviet Union. And there are reasons for why certain groups were targeted and not others. So, of course, there's that. There's this question of how did this Black guy get swept up in this? That's kind of an entry into it. I think what makes him stand out first and foremost is he grew up in the South. He did not grow up or really have a formative period in New York. I mean, he eventually lived there, but he grew up in the South. He's the son of a former slave. And from what I found about the community in Dallas, the Black community, it was a really interesting place that had its own, they called it a city within the city. There was a section of Dallas called Freedmantown that was established by former slaves. Fort-Whiteman's father, Moses, arrived in Dallas sometime in the early 1880s. And in this enclave, there were doctors, lawyers, dentists, entrepreneurs, shopkeepers, all Black. And it kind of, this microcosm, I think, allowed him to, it gave him a kind of political horizon, but it allowed him to eventually leave Dallas, go to a variety of different institutions of higher education, and sent him on his journey to eventually into radical politics and of course, traveling to the Soviet Union. So I think that experience I don't mean to emphasize it too much, but there is a connection I see in his own personal life between trying to realize the promises of emancipation and reconstruction and him taking an avenue to realize those promises that many did in the early 20th century, but others took other paths. And the question is, why did he look abroad? Why did he look outside of America for his utopia?
No, super well put. And I think that does make him distinct. And we'd love to listen to that in the audio documentary when that comes out.
Yes.
So I've done some very cursory reading about African American travels to the Soviet Union, and because this is the illustrious Bishkek Express podcast, I want to give Central Asia a little shout out. And there is a Central Asian component, as you said, in our email correspondence. And from what I have understood, correct me if I'm wrong, there were some African Americans who were interested in traveling to Soviet Central Asia because they saw Central Asia as an alternative to Western imperialism and race segregation in the United States. And that's probably so with the rest of the Soviet Union. I'm not sure. So additionally, you said that Fort-Whiteman had traveled to Turkmenistan. Is that so?
Yes, well, so I'll tell the story and I'll speak about the significance of Central Asia. So Fort-Whiteman, he comes to the Soviet Union in 1924 as a delegate to the Fifth Comintern Congress. And he ends up staying about, I want to say 18 months. And he begins to travel around. Now, on the one hand, he is interested, he has a long time interest in ethnicity. In ethnology, he actually eventually gets a scholarship to Moscow State University in 1928 to study in the Institute of Ethnology. He's taken classes with he's corresponded with Franz Boas. He's taken courses of anthropology at various universities throughout his life in the United States. So he has an intellectual interest in these questions. He has an intellectual interest in science. So going and seeing how the Soviet Union deals with ethnic diversity is really key to him. The other thing, too, is that the Soviets, here's this black guy. We want to make a connection in our revolutionary international communist movement to issues of race and anti-colonialism, and they turn Fort-Whiteman into a celebrity. He gets to speak at various conferences. He travels around and gives talks. He goes to Central Asia. They rename a village after him. They make him an honorary correspondent for some university, some newspaper. And so he's really there's this, and one of the episodes will actually deal with his celebrity and how his personality connected to that. So that's how he's able to travel around. He's kind of taken around and propagated throughout the Soviet Union. But the interest in Central Asia is exactly that. People like Fort-Whiteman, Langston Hughes, Angela Davis, Muhammad Ali, just to name a couple throughout the 20th century, when they went to the Soviet Union, they all went to Central Asia. And one of the things they wanted to understand, these people are brown people like us in America. How do brown people fare under the communist system? How does the communist system benefit brown people in the Soviet Union? And this is to give them a reflection on their status in the United States. A lot of people, and of course they're shown what the Soviets want them to see. It's not like, and honestly, I think it's wrong to expect them to see anything else. They're just there for a short amount of time. They don't necessarily have the language skills. It's a strange place that they've never been there before. Like any tourists, nobody leaves a country thinking they saw, all of the great and the ugly. So in many respects, it's a show, right? But I think it's important to remember, and this is for his story, but I think African Americans in general, there is a tendency to say, hey, look at these people. They bought into this Soviet stuff. They were duped. Fort-Whiteman is a prime example. Look, it cost him his life. But I think what's missing in that is what they think Soviet society is like, what they think ethnic relations are like, gives them a vision to understand their own situation. It gives them a potential alternative of how do you imagine a different type of an anti-racist society or a raceless society in its most extreme utopianism. And I think the other important thing about the connections to Central Asia, but also being in the Soviet Union and being in the Comintern in particular, is the American struggle for African American freedom becomes internationalized. Because first you meet people from Asia. Like, for example, there's a photograph of Fort-Whiteman. 2 people next to him is Ho Chi Minh. He meets people from other parts of the world that aren't from Europe and learns about their struggles, begins to make common cause with their struggle. Whether it's non-Russians in the Soviet Union, people from the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, Asia. And this makes race not just an American issue. And perhaps how it's understood in America is even more perverse than we thought, if we look at other societies. So I think that's what's important to this kind of consciousness. This race consciousness on a global level is really unique at this period of time in African American history. You don't have this before.
Mm-hmm. That's something I had not thought about, was the internationalization of the African American struggle. And I'm curious, he was touted around Central Asia, but was there African American interest in the Caucasus or other regions of Russia?
He was interested. In fact, he writes a letter sometime in the 1930s that he's learning Chechen and Avar.
No way.
Yeah. He, I don't have any documentation on this, so I don't know much. But when he is during his scholarship at MGU, he does some sort of field work in the Caucasus. He doesn't go into it. He had plans to write a book about race and ethnicity in the Soviet Union that he, for all I know, if he did start it, those documents have been lost. He certainly never finished it and published it, unfortunately. I mean, he wasn't a great intellectual figure, I should say that. What made him kind of rise to prominence in communist circles is he was a good self-promoter. He had a tendency to boast. He had a tendency to make big promises. He certainly loved the role of attention and being whisked around and giving speeches, whether it's in the United States or the Soviet Union. I think he really cherished his celebrity role. And when that burnt out, he was kind of lost. It also, and this is connected to when he's eventually arrested, it also created a lot of resentment, particularly amongst other African-American communists, because they were like, why is this guy going to these things? We have perfectly capable, if not better, more active, better activists than this guy. Why him? And I think at the end of the day, he was not a well-liked man.
Mind blown. But he certainly must have been an excellent orator.
There are indications that he was a good speaker. He apparently had a Texan accent.
Oh boy.
So you can only imagine what that sounds like with a Black American inflection. But he was seen as a good speaker. But unfortunately, we don't really know outside of descriptions because we don't have his voice recorded, or certainly no film or video. So we only have photographs of him, and that's about, and his handwriting, his beautiful, beautiful handwriting, which just is just this flowery cursive, which is a testament to his identity and education as well.
So if he was seen as like not the guy, how were those that he was in correspondence with, like W.E.B. Du Bois? Like, did they also think of him as a flunky later on, or he wasn't the right man?
Well, he didn't, it's not like he had a really close relationship with these people, right? He wrote Du Bois a couple of letters, some from the Soviet Union. When he was trying to organize the American Negro Labor Congress, he sent out letters to everybody to try to get them involved, to get them to come to the Congress. We don't know what Du Bois thought of him, because Du Bois's responses to his letters are just like, yeah, let's meet at whatever. There's no like long kind of discussion about him, who he is. And you can see that in a lot of letters with his correspondence. What made him succeed or be at the top, to essentially be throughout the 1920s the American Communist Party's race man, is patronage and connections. He had a very close relationship with a man named Robert Minor, who was one of the first members of the American Communist Party. He'd been involved in radicalism for many years. And Minor was one of the few white communists in America that really devoted his time and interest in questions of race. And I think through that relationship, he kind of buttressed Fort-Whiteman. But at the same time, as I said, there are rumors already in the mid-1920s that maybe he's a police informant, that maybe he's a Trotskyist, something or other. There's kind of, or he just doesn't, he was eventually fired from being the organizer for the American Negro Labor Congress because he refused to go back down south, for example. I think people got, my impression is that people began to see him as more into the celebrity than really the hard, grinding, boring day-to-day work of organizing.
Do you think that the Soviet officials that he was around also sensed this, or was it?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't have any indication because, again, too, there isn't a lot of material evaluating him as a person. You only get, for the most part of what I have, is how he evaluated himself, and through this language. I think he had a certain sense of self-aggrandizement. But I do think I don't think he was cynical. I don't want to say that he wasn't a true believer. He clearly was, with the ups and downs that come with that. But I don't have a sense of how the Soviets really saw him. And perhaps for them, it didn't really matter, except that at the end, he turned out to be suspicious enough to do something about.
Mm-hmm. If you don't mind, let's zoom out a little bit. You discussed something earlier in your introduction of Fort-Whiteman that I would like to ask a question about. So, do you mind discussing the significance of Fort-Whiteman within the Socialist Party, particularly as a Black American-born member during a time when the party was mainly immigrant Europeans?
Right. So he is, he's not the first Black to join the party, but he's probably the first Black American. The first Black to join the party, from what we know of, is a guy from Suriname called Otto Hoeswild, who was a colleague of Fort-Whiteman's. But one of the challenges of him, and I think Blacks on the left in general at that time, and one could say even Blacks on the left today, is how do you get a bunch of these white people to take race seriously? And not in the sense that, in this kind of crude Marxist thing where, well, once the revolution comes, all of these questions of race will be dealt with. It's class. Well, America is particular. America has its own race matrix. And in many cases, one may say race matters more than class. I mean, I don't think it's controversial to say that. So the question is, how do you get them to take it seriously? How do you get them to speak to, potential African-American members or at least supporters? How do you organize people in the South in particular, which there's a wonderful book about by Robin D.G. Kelly called Hammer and Hoe that he wrote many years ago about Alabama communists. But so one of the things he also wants to do, that is Fort-Whiteman, he wants to organize an all-Black labor organization that is not necessarily communist, but brings elements of, left of center under one kind of umbrella. And he'd been talking about that since the early 20s. And he's not alone, of course, right? He's not the inventor of this idea. So that's part of his struggle. And he, while he gets to tour around and he gives speeches and he writes articles, the party's investment, and this is what's actually really interesting about his experience and others like him as communists, American Party's investment is only, for the most part, lip service. until the Soviets make them. The black members, when they join, like, for example, Harry Haywood, who's one of the most prominent black communists in the 1930s. He's the one that comes up with this famous black belt thesis that I can talk about if you're interested. He said in his memoir, when he joined the party, he didn't join the American Party. He joined the Comintern. So they saw themselves as joining an international movement. And one of the things you see in the documents, when they go to the Soviet Union and meet with officials in the Comintern, they put pressure on the Soviets to put pressure on the Americans to take race seriously. So they like to lobby, they lobby the Soviets to get them to put pressure, as I said.
Wow. And I am interested, did you just explain the black belt?
So in 1928 at the 6th Comintern Congress, and this is really the fruit of that pressure. This Congress is really pivotal. There is a major resolution passed by the Communist International that says to the American Party and others that have potential black constituencies, South Africa, to some extent the French and the British, but the Americans and Canadians as well, but the Americans are really the main focus, and the South Africans, I should say. They come out with a resolution that at its most radical calls for the establishment of a autonomous black republic in the American South. That is the Black Belt. So Alabama, Mississippi, northern Louisiana, parts of Arkansas. At its basic, the resolution is calling for a couple of things. First, self-determination of Black Americans. Now, the question is, what does that mean? And that is something that they fought about, in party meetings in the United States. The resolution called for a struggle against what they called white chauvinism, which is essentially racism. So much so that the Communist Party of America puts on a big show trial of a white Finnish immigrant who is racist against some blacks in the party, and they do this whole pageantry of putting him on trial to expel him from the party, publish pamphlets and stuff. But they actually do a campaign against white chauvinism in the early 1930s, and they put more resources into organizing and bringing black members into the party. What's interesting is the early 30s, the black membership of the American Communist Party actually increases quite substantially. So again, it's really the patronage of the Soviets that allow for these things to happen. Okay,
so that was successful in that case with Soviet.
Well, it's successful until it isn't. I mean, like, for example, okay, so you say there's supposed to be this self-determination in the American South along the Black Belt. Okay, that sounds great. But what about people who live in Chicago or Harlem? What does self-determination mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, when somebody is racist, what do? Do you expel them from the party? Do you reprimand them? What does racism mean? Oh, and then what happens when they turn around and talk about black chauvinism? Or what's interesting, and that resolution was authored by Harry Haywood and a Russian communist. I can't remember his name at the moment, but when you look at it, a lot of it looks like them trying to import Soviet nationality policy into the United States. Right. So if, Bashkir have an autonomous republic, well, why can't African Americans?
That is some crazy juxtaposition.
Well, this is the thing, like Harry Haywood is, for a long time, people thought that this was authored and orchestrated by Stalin. But the documents don't show that. It actually is one of the brainchilds of Harry Haywood. He's somehow taken with this kind of Leninist nationality policy and wants to see how it works in the United States.
Okay, so for critics, they didn't necessarily see it as like this Soviet-sponsored resolution, or did they?
Well, so the problem with the resolution and with self-determination for people, and Fort-Whiteman was one of them. Actually, the majority of blacks in leadership circles in the American Party opposed it. And the reason why they opposed it is because it sounded like segregation.
Mm.
Now, the problem, what the communists are trying to do, both in the American and Soviet Union, is they're trying to appeal to, on the left, in black circles, fellow travelers, but also the black nationalists, people in the Marcus Garvey movement, which at the time is the largest grassroots black political organization in the United States. It's the largest then, and I would think to say it's been the largest since. And so they were trying to, by appealing to self-determination and kind of race as a national identity rather than just a racial category, they were trying to appeal to that nationalist wing of Black American politics. So they're trying to wed and stitch together a bunch of seemingly contradictory things. And people like Fort-Whiteman and others around him, like I said, the majority of the black, people in black leadership circles in the party opposed this resolution. Because they were integrationalists, right? Their question was, what is the place of Black Americans in American society? And the Black Belt thesis seemed to suggest the place of Blacks in American society is their own, regions, their own autonomy. They're not going to be integrated into white society. I
see. The Black Belt thesis is something I've never heard of, so I'm very, very interested in that. I'll have to do some auxiliary research aside from that. Let's go back to Whiteman again. So you were kind enough to email me a letter addressed to the Communist Party member Robert Minor, who you have already explained, and it's dated September 28th, 1924. And I would like to read the first 3 paragraphs to our listeners, so sit back, get comfortable. So, I have returned to Moscow from Central Asia, Turkestan, and Bukhara. I was about a month of traveling in various parts of Central Asia in the interest of the International Red Aid Society, that is, the MOPR. My work was to extend the work into those parts, a society for the aid of political prisoners in all lands throughout the world. Without exaggeration, no American president was ever accorded the reception traveling through America that was given to me during my work and travel through Central Asia. On arriving in Tashkent, Turkestan, I was received by a delegation at the station and, of course, given the best hotel accommodation in the city. A secretary interpreter was attached to me, an English professor at the University of Tashkent. I took him on my travels through Central Asia. Also, one of the best automobiles in the city was daily at my service. The work was strenuous, having to make 2 and sometimes 4 speeches a day. The meetings were held both among the Russian and native peoples, the latter being the Mohammedans. I might have transcribed that improperly.
He essentially means Muslims.
Ah, okay. When visiting the big railroad shops and factories, the managers would have the whistles blown, calling hundreds of men from work that I might talk to them. My visit to the Republic of Bukhara was exceedingly interesting. On arriving, I was received by the president and several members of his cabinet. My secretary-interpreter and I were lodged in an old palace of the former king or emir of Bukhara, who 4 years ago fled the border into Afghanistan at the approach of the Red Army. There is no International Red Aid Society at or in Bukhara, so I founded one. Last paragraph. The Jews of the city of Bukhara honored me by naming their school for girls after me. Thus, the school today bears the name in Russian, Shkola Whitemanskaya. The evening before I left Bukhara, the president and the Republic and members of his cabinet entertained me with an elaborate banquet, and during the course of the banquet presented me with a beautiful native costume. The president of Bukhara is about my age and looks much like a State Street dandy. He looks very much like an American Negro. He gave his portrait and an album of beautiful pictures of Bukhara life. This scene is absolutely extraordinary, and I think it very well illustrates how he became such a personality in Central Asia. And upon my reading, it wasn't like self-aggrandizement, but I mean, I could also see maybe some hues of it. But certainly how he was so well received and he was so warmly welcomed. But asking this question, I feel a little bit silly because you explained that perhaps it was somewhat of a show, but at least maybe for the common man, do you think that the warm reception was reflective of the impact of his work there? And what else do you make of this excerpt that I just read off?
Well, the first thing I want to say about the excerpt, and I'll get to the what it meant. One can imagine, or try to imagine, here you are, a black guy, 1920s, coming from 1920s America, which is like the low point of race relations. You know, from the 1890s to the early 30s is a really horrible period of racial violence, discrimination, Jim Crow, etc. So I think we have to imagine what it was like for him to arrive in a place like that and be treated by royalty. You know, Langston Hughes, when he's traveling to Central Asia on the train, he mentions how he gets on the train and he's not Jim Crowed. He can sit wherever he wants. He meets some Central Asian party official who is the secretary of some little town or whatever district. And he's like, brown person who's in a leadership position. And he has to remind himself that the Russians are white, or they look white. The feeling of physical safety is another thing. I mean, think of the psychological impact of that. When Harry Haywood, but also Paul Robeson, and not just other blacks who go to the Soviet Union, one of the things they say is for the first time, they felt like a human being. You also get this, you know, blacks who go to France and to Germany as well in the 20s and after into the 1960s, right? You can look at James Baldwin, who basically quits America and goes and lives in France, or Ta-Nehisi Coates, who quit America and went to live in France, because they find that their race doesn't fully define them as it does in the United States. So one can imagine the psychological impact of the physical safety, but also the fact that you feel like people are treating you as a human being. In terms of how, is your question about how regular people, like regular Soviet citizens, understood what was going on, or?
Yes, I would like to take that angle.
You know, who knows? You know, who knows how they understood all of this? I would imagine, and this is just from memoirs of both Black American, but also Africans who go to the Soviet Union in the 20th century, there's a lot of fascination. You know, most people have never seen a Black person in their life. That comes, of course, with there's racism, because they've certainly heard or read about, at least some of them have. I don't know how many. But in terms of how they accepted all of this, it's really hard to say. I will say this, though, you know, and this is based off a book that Meredith Roman wrote called Opposing Jim Crow, which is about Soviet anti-racism. Being an anti-racist, according to Roman, and I agree with her, is to be a good new Soviet person, right? This project of becoming a new person in the 20s and 30s in the Soviet Union. To be anti-racist is part of that project. Is part of that identity of becoming a new Soviet person. And you can see, you know, the Soviet press had propaganda that tried to propagate the, you know, understanding of race and racism in America to Soviet readers as well. How they understood it, it's very hard to say.
Mm-hmm. And there was news articles published about him all the way from Moscow during this time,
yes.
even.
Yes, yeah. There are press. He actually wrote an article that's in the press, in the newspapers. Some of his speeches were transcribed. Yeah. So
it's insane. You put it in a way that really made it come to light for me, but he wasn't just treated like royalty. He was treated by royalty, the president and his cabinet members rolling out the red carpet to meet this man and people rushing up to just shake his hand and talk to him, just hearing him speak.
But, in a way, one way we could take that scene is like, okay, here is just the Soviets doing their propaganda again. Or we can take it as any other traveler who's exotic, Black American, coming to this, these people have probably never seen an American in their life, let alone a Black one. And what do they want to do? They want to show this foreigner the best aspects of their society. They want to greet them. And, what that being in that part of a world is like, right? The hospitality is really important. So, on the one hand, it's not wrong to say this is all staged propaganda. Of course it is. But on the other hand, I think there's something genuine nonetheless in welcoming our brother, Fort-Whiteman from America, our Black brother, right?
Certainly. And this display, I mean, even when I try to read between the lines, nothing at all seems disingenuous, like through his words.
Yeah.
But incredible scene. So by this point, after reading the letter, after hearing some of his background, despite it being disjointed, you'll connect the dots later. Do you think it's appropriate that Times Magazine would dub him the reddest of the Blacks?
No. This is in thinking about celebrity, right? We've talked a lot about the celebrity in the Soviet Union, right? Being given the best car, the best hotel, being greeted by all these important people, the banquets and all this stuff. His celebrity had another component, celebrity nonetheless, and that is as a dangerous Black radical in America. When he comes back from the Soviet Union in the summer of 1925, he is all over the American press. They are all spun all sorts of conspiracies about him and what his connection is to the communists. And that calling him the reddest of the Blacks is, not a label that should be celebrated in that time period. And I think he relished that celebrity too. The fact that there's FBI files on him from this period, that they're informants, informing on him. There are articles in the press following his, as he's touring America. The Black press is even writing against, like, look at this foolish guy buying into this communist propaganda, et cetera, et cetera. So, he's famous in the Soviet Union and he's notorious in America. And I should say that in the 1950s, the FBI is still looking for him. They don't know what happened to him. So in his FBI file from all the way in the 50s, the FBI is going around and asking all these communists, hey, you know what happened to this guy? Where is he? Some are saying, oh, he went to Africa to organize anti-colonial struggles. Oh, he disappeared. We don't know what happened to him. Maybe he came back to the United States. Maybe he disappeared in the Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera. There's some rumors, of course, that he was arrested. But it's interesting that, even 10 years, 12 years after he dies, he's still kind of a ghost that the American authorities are at least interested in to some extent.
Mm. And knowing you, I'm almost certain you're going to include this unexplored facet of this negative celebrity side of it. Incredible. And do you have these FBI intelligence agency dossiers around? They're accessible?
I do. There are two. There is one that's generated in 1919. He's arrested in St. Louis after giving a speech to 12 white guys. It's fascinating because the police raid this group of 12 crusty socialists in Fort-Whiteman giving a speech. They bust down the door. They arrest all of them. They throw Fort-Whiteman. They interrogate him. This is frankly how you find out a lot about his life. They interrogate him and the police, and then they want to charge him with sedition. They recognize we don't have enough to get him on sedition. So then they're like, well, we'll get him on perjury because he was in Mexico. And this is another aspect of his life that I wish I had more material on, but he spent a couple of years in southern Mexico working with some anarchist group. What he was doing there, who knows? But he obviously, skipped the draft, even though he ended up registering for it. But local police in St. Louis are saying we needed to arrest this guy because if we didn't, there would be a race riot, like in Chicago or the other places around the country that are exploding. It's nothing like. At one point, one of the U.S. district attorneys writes back and said, "You know what? Don't be ridiculous. This guy is not gonna foment a revolution." But there's lots of paper generated about him back and forth about what to do with him. He ends up spending a couple of months in jail. So he does have that notoriety, and that's the first time he's all over the press.
That was a very interesting and perplexing feature. I think I read this from the Jacobin article, but he was in the Yucatan, I think, in Mexico. Yeah, got to figure that out.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of mystery around that too, because he clearly is in the United States in certain times when he says he's not. He does go to Mexico. I just don't really know, like I said, A, what he was doing there. And B, how long he was actually there. Because one of the things that I have when he says he's in Mexico, he is in a production of Othello, because he's a stage actor briefly, and he's a student at one of the HBCs, I think Morgan. So it's Mercury when he was where he was and all of this stuff.
Yeah, we have to unravel this. I mean, incredible again. I'm going to fast forward a little bit just to make sure we get this segment in. Going back to the letter, from my own understanding, we're going to talk about the conclusion. I'm going to skip a little bit of the core of the paper. He keeps referencing university, and upon a Google search, he's referring to the University of Eastern Peoples. That's correct, right?
Yes.
Okay. And upon just more like top-level research, it seems to be called the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. Very choppy title, very strong
doesn't
title.
Roll off the tongue.
It certainly does not. From what I understand, it's essentially a communist international training institution, prep school, something of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
So we're going to read a concluding paragraph. Please emphasize this to Robert Minor that the establishing of a class Negro students here creates a new department in the university. English-speaking teachers have always been difficult to get, that is, persons who know English and Russian. There has been one class of 3 years ago of English-speaking students. The more popular European languages in Russia have always been German and French. By having as many as 10 Negro students in a class, they can be supplied with a staff of English-speaking teachers who many not know Russian. This is the point. Let Robert Minor select a supply of books which may be used either as textbooks or for supplementary reading, such as Social Forces in American History, A Good Economic History of America, Development of American Imperialism, etc. By all means, there should be a few copies of The History of the Negro, and Du Bois' little book, The Negro, suggests itself. But it is so full of race propaganda, I wonder if it would be useful. It would be well if Minor would compile a book of about the same size that would serve as an abridged history of the Negro, which could be used by the class. He would not need to publish it, but prepare a few mimeographed copies. Such is much desired. It could be rendered into Russian, French, and German, and used as collateral reading in all universities and schools, as well as Comintern. His articles of last winter on the Negro were much appreciated in Russia, and several persons expressed the wish that they may be put in a pamphlet form and used here in the University for Eastern Peoples. He is regarded here by many as an authority on the Negro questions. So I feel like there is, just for the sake of time, I shortened, didn't include a lot of the middle, but what are some of the big highlights in this conclusion, or like things that were scrunched into the conclusion. I don't know how else to word it.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that there's actually no direct evidence that he was a student at the Communist University of Toilers of the East. I've gone through their records and I haven't found any mention of him. Though that doesn't mean that he wasn't. I mean, he obviously was connected in some form or fashion, which isn't surprising. A little bit about that institution. That was the Soviet Union created two institutions of education for foreigners, foreign communists. There's the Communist University of Toilers of the East, which had students from Asia, Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and also Black Americans. Oh, I'm sorry. There are actually three institutions. The second institution was one like that, but for Western Europeans. And then there was the Lenin School, which was established a bit later, and that Black students didn't go to, but by the late 1920s and early 30s, they changed the policy, and Black students started going there. These institutions range anywhere between, learning about Marxist whatever, communist ideology, basic, courses in mathematics and these kinds of things, and also to, organizing. And some people have suggested even some kind of military training, though I'm not sure. I haven't seen any indication of that, but who knows? So what he's trying to do is he's trying to recruit Black Americans to come to the Soviet Union and go to these institutions and experience Soviet life. And when he returns to Chicago, he does just that. For example, are you familiar with a woman named Yelena Khanga?
I'm afraid not.
So Yelena is Afro-Russian. She is a talk show host. She had she was known as the Russian Oprah in the 1990s. She had like a talk show of like sex and stuff. It was very revolutionary. She's Afro-Russian. Her father was an ambassador, I believe, from Zimbabwe. He was assassinated. Her mother was born in the Soviet Union, the child of a man named Oliver Golden and Bertha Golden. Bertha was Jewish, white, Oliver black. Fort-Whiteman was one of the people that recruited Oliver Golden to go to the Soviet Union.
Wow.
And Golden was trained in Tuskegee in agronomy. And of course, because America being America, he couldn't find a job above a janitor. And when he went to the Soviet Union, he actually settled in Uzbekistan and became, if I remember correctly, the head of purchasing foreign technology for the cotton industry in Uzbekistan. And his children, and of course Yelena, all live very cultured Soviet life. And so here's actually an interesting connection to Fort-Whiteman's story that, he recruited some Black Americans, some of which stayed in the Soviet Union, and had, varied lives. But in Oliver Golden's case, I think probably had a life much better than, say, he would have in the United States.
I think his effort to get Black students to the Soviet Union just goes to show his genuineness towards the cause.
For sure. He gets completely enamored with the Soviet Union. He begins to dress like a Bolshevik. He's walking in South Side of Chicago with this crazy Bolshevik getup. When he organizes the American Negro Labor Congress, the intermission, he has some sort of crazy Russian ballet. And everyone in the audience is like, what the hell is this? Like, what's going on here? He's in his FBI report, an informant tells FBI agents how he doesn't want to be in America. He wants to go back to the Soviet Union, and eventually does. And like I said, in 1928. And his life, though, after that is not as glamorous as it was before, I should say.
So I'm afraid I'll have to condense this part. As far as the fate and the Gulag sentence, I think the listeners just have to wait and see your...
Yeah, there's some stuff I don't want to reveal anyways about what I know and who's, what I think actually happened. I'll just say this in terms of why he's arrested. I don't think it has very little to do with politics. Politics is the idiom in which these people spoke. I believe that his arrest is somewhat connected to they just don't like him. He's just not a liked man. And there's other things, but yeah.
Okay. So we sort of know the climax, but as far as everything else, just have to tune in. But before we go, I want to know if you have any overarching concluding thoughts about the story of Lovett Whiteman.
I think one of the conclusions, and it's kind of a realization, especially in light of, George Floyd's murder, Black Lives Matter protests, the emergence of issues of police violence and race really to the surface of American society for a couple of years now. It's kind of gone. What really struck me is first, a lot of the questions, the political questions we're dealing with today around race and class are the same ones they were dealing with then. And that was kind of a sad realization. Like after all these years, we can't solve this problem. There's that. The second is and this actually comes from an American historian. There's one historian named Glenda Gilmore, who I should make sure I mention. Until me, if I may say, she had done the most research on Fort-Whiteman. And her book, Defying Dixie, where she devotes a chapter to him, is about the long civil rights movement. We have a tendency to think of the civil rights movement as beginning in the 1950s or in the late 40s. It really stretches back until the 1920s when Black Americans who fought abroad in World War I come back. And, they're fighting for freedom against authoritarianism in Europe, in the trenches in Europe, and then come back to Jim Crow America. And this galvanizes, like it does many veterans in the 1920s, regardless of country. So this long civil rights movement. And then the internationalism of that movement and the role the Soviet Union plays in it. A lot of the communist positions, whether we like it or not, in the 1920s and 30s are basically non-controversial and accepted today. Black equality, before the law, Black rights, political rights, economic rights, they were ahead of the curve when it came to that struggle. And a lot of it had to do with the idea that the Russian Revolution captured the minds and inspired a lot of these Black folk who are looking for a path to justice. And I think those who try to brandish them as dupes, as fooled, as naive, are really doing a disservice and an injustice to their looking for a path, a way to get out of this mess that this country has been in for so long.
What an overarching theme, and sincerely, thank you for that explanation. I want to thank you so much for appearing on our podcast today. It's been great having listened to you for such a long time, hearing your words. Well, I look very much forward to the audio documentary. And a special thank you to the Carlene On Air studio. Thank you for the wonderful color scheme and the great production quality. So, thank you everyone, and like and subscribe. See you next time.